Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The trouble with Monday mornings is that they arrive with the stubborn punctuality of bad news, and the Monday in question, the 14th of October, with a wind off the Hudson that had apparently decided to audition for a nor'easter, was no exception. I had eaten Fritz's Eggs Benedict, read the sports section twice, and was engaged in my third cup of coffee when the doorbell rang at 11 minutes past 10. Wolfe was upstairs with his orchids, which is where he lives between 9 and 11 every morning, as immovably as a geological formation. Fritz was in the kitchen, performing his daily negotiations with a leg of lamb. That left me, Archie Goodwin, to open the front door of the brownstone on West 35th Street and assess whatever the morning had dragged in. What it had dragged in was a woman of about 40, who looked like she'd spent the last 72 hours conducting a private war with sleep, and sleep had won decisively. She was handsome in the architectural sense. Good bones, fine jaw, dark eyes that would have been striking under better circumstances. Her coat was a charcoal cashmere that probably cost more than my monthly salary, and her gloves were dove gray. When she pulled the right one off to shake my hand, her fingers were cold enough to make the point without any elaboration. "I need to see Nero Wolfe," she said. "My name is Cecilia Hartwell. My brother has been murdered, and the police have decided with impressive efficiency to be wrong about who did it." I liked her immediately. Anyone who leads with her position that clearly generally means to conduct business, not theater. "Come in, Miss Hartwell," I said. "Or is it Mrs.?" "Miss." She said it without the faint apology some women of 40 attach to the word. "Will he see me?" "He'll see you at 11. He's with his orchids until then, and wouldn't come down if the building were on fire. And I have some evidence on that point. Come into the office." I settled her in the red leather chair across from Wolfe's desk, the chair reserved for clients, positioned so Wolfe can observe them while pretending to merely think, and brought her coffee, which she held in both hands without drinking, using it apparently for warmth and ballast. She studied the office while she waited. Most people do. It's a room worth studying. The bookshelves, the globe, the desk the size of a small aircraft carrier, the 2 yellow chairs, and, since Wolfe had recently returned from a particularly successful auction, a new Renoir sketch on the east wall that I privately thought was a shade too cheerful for the room. Cecilia Hartwell studied it all with the careful eye of someone accustomed to reading environments. "He's very comfortable," she said, not disapprovingly. "He's worked at it," I agreed. At 3 minutes past 11, I heard the elevator. Wolfe is opposed to stairs on philosophical grounds. And then he was in the doorway. Nero Wolfe measures 1/7 of a ton, a fact he neither advertises nor apologizes for. He has a face that in repose suggests a Roman emperor who has seen enough of human folly to have formed fixed opinions, and small eyes that are capable of conveying, in rapid succession, contempt, amusement, and a sharpness that makes most people feel their thoughts are being read without their permission. He was wearing his standard office outfit, a dark 3-piece suit of a quality that Fritz would have approved, and his expression was one of prepared tolerance. He crossed to his desk, lowered himself into the reinforced chair that is his throne, and looked at Cecilia Hartwell for a long moment. "Miss Hartwell," he said, "you have not slept in 2 days. You are angry rather than grieving, which suggests you believe the anger has more immediate utility. And you have come to me because you distrust the police's conclusions, not because you distrust the police themselves. That last point is interesting. Most people who come here have given up on the authorities entirely. You have not. What have they concluded that you find insufficient?" She set her coffee cup down. "They've arrested a man named Daniel Voss for my brother's murder. He's my brother's former business partner. They have circumstantial evidence that, I grant you, sounds damning. He had motive. He was in the building. His fingerprints are on a paperweight that was—" She paused. "That was the murder weapon." "But," Wolfe said, "but Daniel Voss did not kill my brother. I know this not from sentiment. I have no great affection for Mr. Voss, and he had legitimate grievances against Edmund, but from a fact the police apparently haven't considered worth examining. The fact being, at the time my brother was killed, the medical examiner places it between 8 and 10 in the evening. Daniel Voss was playing cards with 3 other men in an apartment on the Upper East Side. I have verified this independently. 2 of those men are not friends of Voss. They had no reason to lie for him. They simply told me where he was. Wolfe's expression had not changed, but I noticed these things, that his right index finger moved a 1/4 inch along his desk blotter. It's a gesture so small that most people never see it. It means he's interested. And the police, he said, say the alibi is unverifiable through official channels, because none of the 4 men called attention to the game at the time. There was gambling involved, real money. They are reluctant to volunteer the information formally. She folded her hands. I don't want Daniel Voss exonerated as a kindness. I want my brother's actual killer identified. If Voss is acquitted on procedural grounds and the real murderer walks, that is an outcome I find intolerable. As would any sensible person. Wolfe picked up his book. He keeps a current volume on the desk corner and opens it between thoughts as other men fidget with pens, then set it down again without opening it. Tell me about your brother. Edmund Hartwell, as Cecilia laid him out for us over the next 40 minutes, had been a man who inspired strong feelings in nearly everyone who knew him. And almost none of those feelings were simple. He was 53, a dealer in pre-Columbian antiquities, and more recently in African ivory artifacts, the latter a business that had made him considerably wealthy and had given him, according to his sister, a collection of enemies that he tended with almost as much care as the collection itself. He had operated Hartwell Cultural Acquisitions from a suite on the 14th floor of a building on 57th Street. His business had recently come under scrutiny from both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and a federal task force investigating the international ivory trade. Not because Edmund had been caught doing anything explicitly illegal, but because several pieces that had passed through his inventory had subsequently been traced to protected sources. He told me the provenance documentation was legitimate, Cecilia said. I believed him. I'm not certain I should have. The business partner, Voss, I said. What was the nature of his grievance? Edmund bought him out 18 months ago. Daniel believed the valuation was fraudulent, and Edmund had deliberately suppressed the apparent worth of the business at the time of the buyout, by concealing a significant upcoming deal. The deal materialized 3 months later. It was worth considerably more than the entire valuation at which Voss had sold his share. He has a point, I said. He has a lawsuit, she corrected, which is where it stood when Edmund died. The lawsuit was scheduled for preliminary hearings next month. Wolfe had been listening with his eyes half closed, which is his attitude of maximum attention, though it fools people regularly into thinking he's drifting. Who else had reason to wish your brother ill? She counted them off without hesitation, which told me she'd been doing this arithmetic privately for some time. There was Raymond Cho, Edmund's current associate, and the man who handled the logistical side of the business, the shipping, the documentation, the relationship with overseas suppliers. There was Margot Trent, Edmund's private secretary, and Cecilia implied, with a careful economy of words, something beyond that, who had been present in the office suite the evening of the murder, and had been the one to find the body. There was Victor Ashford, a collector and longtime client, who had 6 weeks before the murder demanded the return of a piece he claimed Edmund had sold him under false provenance, and had been refused. And there was a man Cecilia knew only slightly, referred to in Edmund's private correspondence as the Lisbon contact, whose role in the business she couldn't fully articulate. The police, Wolfe said, are aware of all these persons. They are aware of them. They have spoken to them. They returned to Voss anyway. Because the fingerprints on the paperweight were persuasive, and the alternative suspects are less conveniently packaged. Wolfe closed his eyes entirely for a moment, then opened them. Miss Hartwell, I will require a fee of $20,000, half now, half upon resolution. I will require your brother's business records, to the extent you can obtain them. I will require access to his office suite, which presumably remains under some form of investigative control, but Archie will determine what is accessible. And I will require that you tell me everything you have thus far withheld. The silence that followed had a specific texture. I haven't withheld anything, she said. You have withheld at least one thing. You paused before the word paperweight in your initial account. Not from grief, but from recognition. You know something about that paperweight specifically. What is it? Another pause. Shorter this time. It was ivory, she said quietly. The paperweight. It was a carved ivory piece from Edmund's personal collection. An elephant figurine, approximately 6 inches tall, mid-19th century, West African. He kept it on his desk. She looked at her gloved hand on the arm of the chair. Someone killed my brother with a piece of the collection he'd spent his life building. I find that pointed. Wolfe nodded slowly. As do I. After she left, with the check written and the arrangements made, I stood in the office doorway and watched Wolfe open his book. Well, I said. The ivory trade, he said without looking up, has a long history of producing violence. It is one of commerce's nastier, persistent features. Get Fritz. I want to discuss dinner, and then I want you to tell me everything you observe when you visit that office building tomorrow morning. Just like that? You're not going to tell me what you think? He looked up then. I think, Archie, that the paperweight was not chosen as a weapon of convenience. I think it was chosen as a statement. Whether that statement was made by the killer out of irony, symbolism, or cold-blooded psychology is what we need to determine. He returned to his book. Ask Fritz if he has the burgundy I specified. I went to find Fritz, reflecting that Nero Wolfe's mind was already 6 moves ahead of mine, and that this was a condition I had long since made my peace with, even if I'd never fully announced that to him. The ivory figurine had killed Edmund Hartwell. Somebody had wanted us to think about that. The next morning was an improvement on Monday, the way a dentist's office is an improvement on an emergency room. Marginally less distressing, though the underlying situation hadn't changed. I put on my good gray suit, which I reserve for first impressions, and made my way uptown to the Hartwell Cultural Acquisition Suite on the 14th floor of a building that managed to be simultaneously expensive and anonymous, which is a particular trick of certain midtown blocks. The police seal on the inner office had been reduced to a notice, and a single officer who checked my credentials with the weary courtesy of a man who knows the case is already half decided by his superiors. Cecilia Hartwell had called ahead. I got 20 minutes inside. The office itself told a story, as offices do. Edmund Hartwell had arranged his professional life in a way that announced, without subtlety, that he considered himself a man of culture and means. The walls carried pieces from the collection, framed certificates of authenticity, photographs of acquisition trips, 2 carved wooden masks that watched from the south wall with the patient indifference of objects that had outlived several civilizations, and expected to outlive several more. The desk was mahogany, large and impressively clear, because the police had taken most of what was on it. The empty space where the ivory figurine had stood was marked with a small evidence tag and a circle of faint dust, where nothing had disturbed the surface for longer than the single object had been absent. I noted everything and disturbed nothing, which is the art form. After the office I had 4 conversations to conduct, and I began them that afternoon, and completed the last one the following morning. I'll report them in the order I had them, which is the order that makes the most sense. Raymond Cho received me at a coffee shop on Lexington that he'd chosen, which told me he was the type who prefers neutral ground. He was 41, compact, with the kind of careful stillness that either indicates natural composure or a great deal of practice at appearing composed. He wore glasses with thin wire frames and had the hands of someone who worked with small, precise objects, which fit the profile of a man who handled delicate logistics. "I've spoken to the police," he said, before I fully settled into my chair. "I know. I'm not the police. I'm working for Miss Hartwell. I'm interested in your read on the situation, not your official statement." He thought about this. My read. "You worked with Edmund Hartwell for 6 years. You knew the business. If the police have arrested the wrong man, you probably have a view on who the right one might be." "I have views," he said carefully. "I'm not sure they're useful." Let me judge that. Over the next 30 minutes, Cho gave me a portrait of Edmund Hartwell that was more detailed and more unflattering than his sister's. Not because Cho was unkind, but because he had worked at close range with the man for 6 years and had lost most of his illusions. Edmund had been brilliant and unscrupulous in approximately equal measure. The unscrupulousness had not, in Cho's view, crossed into criminal territory, or at least not into territory that Cho could prove. But it had operated in that particular gray zone where the documentation is always just barely adequate, and the relationships with overseas sources are maintained through a carefully cultivated ignorance of certain details. "The Lisbon contact," I said. Cecilia mentioned him. Cho's stillness became a different quality of stillness. "His name is Ferreira. Paulo Ferreira. He operates as a broker between West African suppliers and European and American dealers. Edmund used him for sourcing. I handled the shipping documentation that came through Ferreira's network." Legitimately? The documentation was legitimate, where the pieces came from before they reached Ferreira. He removed his glasses and polished them, which was the only fidget I'd observed from him. "I asked Edmund about that once. He told me I was paid to handle documentation, not to audit supply chains." "How did you take that?" "As the instruction it was intended to be." He replaced his glasses. "Ferreira was in New York, 2 weeks before Edmund died." I sat up slightly, though I tried not to show it. "You know this how?" "Because I arranged his accommodations. Edmund asked me to book a room at the Warwick. I did. Ferreira was here for 4 days." "Did you meet him?" "Once, briefly. He came to the office." A pause. He and Edmund argued. I wasn't in the room, but I heard the tone through the door. "What about?" "I don't know. When Ferreira left, Edmund was in one of his compressed moods. When Edmund was angry, he didn't expand into it. He contracted, became very quiet and very precise. He was like that for the rest of the day." Cho looked at his coffee. "I thought about telling the police about Ferreira. Then I thought about what happens to a shipping logistics operation when it becomes associated with an international inquiry into ivory trafficking. I thought about my livelihood." "And you told the police nothing?" "I told the police I didn't know of anyone with a specific grievance against Edmund beyond Voss and Ashford," which was true in the technical sense. I looked at him for a moment. He met my gaze without flinching, which told me he'd been living with this compromise long enough to have made his peace with the architecture of it, even if not with the moral furniture. "Ferreira's full name," I said, "and the dates he was here." I wrote them down. Margot Trent was not what I'd expected, which is always a useful beginning. Cecilia Hartwell's careful economy of words regarding Edmund's secretary had painted a picture of something conventionally complicated. The involved employee, the entanglement, the professional relationship blurred at its edges. What I found instead was a woman of 35 who had clearly been crying for 3 days and had also clearly made the decision that she was done with it and was now operating on something harder. She met me at her apartment on West 72nd, a 2-bedroom that was very clean and had good bookshelves and a view of nothing in particular. She made tea without asking if I wanted any, which I found I didn't mind. "You found him?" I said. "Yes, no elaboration. The word was sufficient, and she decided it would remain so." "What time?" 10:23. I know because I looked at my watch. I'd been in the outer office working late. There were shipping invoices I wanted to clear before the week ended. And when I went to tell Edmund I was leaving, the door was open. She paused. He was behind the desk. He'd fallen sideways out of the chair. The figurine was on the floor. "Was there anyone in the outer office when you returned from wherever you'd been during the evening?" "I hadn't been anywhere. I was at my desk from 6 o'clock onward." "Alone?" Raymond was there until 7:30, then I was alone. Something moved across her face, and departed. The police find that convenient. Do you have a view on who did it? She wrapped both hands around her tea mug. I have a view on who had reason to. Victor Ashford. Tell me about Ashford. Victor Ashford has been Edmund's client for 11 years. He's a collector, serious, competitive, the kind who doesn't simply buy beautiful things, but needs to have things that other people can't have. 6 weeks ago, he brought a piece back, a Benin bronze. He claimed Edmund had misrepresented its provenance. Told him it had clear documentation, when in fact, the documentation had a gap that made it potentially problematic under import regulations. She took a careful sip of tea. Edmund refused to take it back or provide a refund. His position was that the documentation he'd provided was accurate as of the date of sale, and any subsequent reclassification was not his liability. Is that position legally defensible? Edmund's lawyer said yes. Ashford's lawyer apparently said no. She set her mug down. Victor Ashford said, and I heard this personally because he called and I was on the line doing a transfer and he didn't know. He said he would see Edmund regret it in a way that outlasted any courtroom. I wrote that down. Those were his exact words? Those were his exact words. You didn't tell the police this. The look she gave me then was complicated enough that it deserved its own chapter. I told the police everything I knew about the evening Edmund died. No one asked me about prior conversations. I'm not a trained investigator, Mr. Goodwin. I answer what I'm asked. I didn't pursue it, but I noted it. Before I left, I asked her one more question, the one I've been saving. The ivory figurine, the one that was used, was it valuable? As a piece? Moderately. It wasn't one of the showpieces. Edmund kept it on his desk because he liked it. He said it reminded him of a sourcing trip he'd made to Lagos in 2015. She looked at the window. He'd had it for almost 10 years. Did anyone know he kept it there, specifically? Anyone who'd been in his office. He never hid it. A pause. It was just his desk. His thing. Everyone knew it was there. Victor Ashford. I saved for the following morning, and I had to wait for him, because he was the type of man who communicates primarily in scheduling as a power demonstration. When he finally received me, in a townhouse on 79th Street that announced money with the restraint of someone who knows they don't have to announce it, he was exactly what I'd assembled from the description. A man of 60, silver-haired, with the smooth operational surface of someone who has spent decades in rooms where words are chosen like chess moves. I'm cooperating with this inquiry as a courtesy to Cecilia, he said, before I'd asked a question. I had nothing to do with Edmund's death. I found his business practices reprehensible, and I've said so in legal documents where that view is on record. That is the full extent of my grievance. You made a threat, I said pleasantly. A pause of approximately 1 second. I expressed frustration in an intemperate call. You said you'd see him regret it in a way that outlasted any courtroom. Another pause, longer. I was angry. Understandably. What did you mean by it? I meant that I intended to pursue every legal avenue available to me and to make certain that his reputation in the collecting community suffered the damage it deserved. He met my eyes with the practiced steadiness of a man who's been in depositions. I meant reputation, Mr. Goodwin, nothing else. Where were you the evening of the 14th, between 8 and 10? At home. My wife was here. My housekeeper was here. That's comfortable. That's a fact. I asked him about Ferreira. His reaction was informative in the way that non-reactions sometimes are. A very slight reorganization of his posture, a recalibration of the expression, a half-second before the response. I know the name, he said. Edmund sourced through him. I was aware of that in a general way. Did you ever meet him? Once, briefly. Edmund introduced us at a gallery event some years ago. Know anything about him beyond that? No, he said. It was the first answer he'd given me that I was fairly confident was a complete lie. I filed it. Back at the brownstone that evening, I gave Wolfe the full report while he worked through Fritz's short ribs, with the concentration he reserves for food and murder, roughly equally. He listened without interrupting, which he does when the material is sufficient to sustain his attention without requiring management. When I finished, he sat for a moment with his wine glass raised to a point just below his chin. "Ferreira," he said. "That's the name that does it for me too," I agreed. 3 separate persons knew of Ferreira's presence in New York. None of them volunteered it to the police. That collective silence is itself data. He set down his glass. And the paperweight, the figurine, was known to everyone who had business in that office. So it wasn't chosen to signal anything exclusive. Anyone could have grabbed it. Or anyone could have chosen it for reasons entirely apart from its availability. He folded his napkin. "There are 2 possibilities we must keep concurrent, Archie. The first is that the murder was committed by someone with a business grievance against Edmund Hartwell, Voss, Ashford, Ferreira, and the ivory figurine was merely what was to hand. The second is that the murder was committed specifically in relation to the ivory trade itself, that the business is not merely background, but the mechanism." Meaning what? Meaning Edmund knew something he wasn't supposed to know? Or had something, Wolfe said quietly, that someone needed to recover. He reached for his book, which is his way of ending the working portion of an evening. "Tomorrow, I want you to find out where Paulo Ferreira currently is, and I want to know everything there is to know about the piece that Ashford returned. Not the provenance dispute, the piece itself. You think the Benin bronze matters? I think everything matters until it demonstrably doesn't," he said, "which is the epistemological foundation of any reasonable inquiry. Good night, Archie." I said good night and went upstairs, and for a long time I lay in the dark, thinking about an ivory elephant that had spent 10 years on a man's desk, and then been used to end the man's life. Whatever the motive, that detail kept catching at something. It felt like the kind of detail that was waiting for the right question. The murder itself, as distinct from the surrounding weather of motives and personalities, had certain fixed features that I spent the better part of Wednesday morning getting straight. I have a contact at the NYPD, Inspector Kramer, who has a relationship with Wolfe that could most precisely be described as a long-running mutual exasperation, and Kramer owes me enough small favors that I can usually get the shape of what the department has without getting the department's editorial opinion on it. I met him at a diner on 9th Avenue where he goes when he doesn't want to be seen at his usual places, which told me the Hartwell case was generating some internal sensitivity. "You're going to tell me Wolfe thinks Voss is the wrong man," he said, over coffee the color of motor oil. "Wolfe has a client with a different theory," I said diplomatically. "The sister." Kramer stirred his coffee without looking at it, which is what he does when he's deciding how much to say. "Look, Archie, the Voss case isn't airtight, I'll tell you that. But it's solid. He was in the building. We have him on the elevator footage at 8:14. His prints are on the murder weapon. He had motive, and he had access. Hartwell's secretary confirms Voss had been in that office multiple times and knew the layout. Elevator footage shows him arriving. Does it show him leaving? A pause. He's not on the camera going out. Is there another way out of the 14th floor? But the stairwell exits to the lobby camera, and he's not on that either. I sat up straighter. Then how did Voss get out of the building? Kramer's expression shifted, in the way that expressions shift when someone raises a question that hasn't been adequately answered. We're still working on that. Because if he can't have gotten out, then either he was still in the building when the body was found, in which case where was he, or the elevator footage is being misread, or, I know the logic, Archie, or he didn't do it, and someone else was in that building during the relevant window. I drank my coffee. What's the window? Medical examiner puts death between 8 and 10. Trent found the body at 10:23. So between 8 and 10:23, someone committed a murder on the 14th floor of a building with active elevator cameras, and either got out without being recorded, or was still in the building. Or entered and left before 8, and the ME's window is slightly off. The ME said between 8 and 10? Said between 8 and 10, most likely closer to 9. Those were his words. I thought about Margot Trent at her desk from 6 o'clock onward, alone from 7:30. I thought about the stairwell that exited to a lobby camera that Voss wasn't on. The stairwell, I said. Does it exit anywhere besides the lobby? Kramer looked at his coffee, then at me. There's a basement level with a service entrance to the alley. And the basement exit. Camera? A longer pause. The camera in the basement corridor was non-operational on the night in question. IT issue. The building's management company has documentation on it. It went down at 6:40 and came back up at 11:15. I stared at him. You're telling me the one camera that covers an alternate exit route went down 4 hours before the murder and came back up after the body was found? I'm telling you, that's what the documentation shows. And you don't find that convenient? I find it interesting, he said, with the carefully modulated understatement of a man who has been in law enforcement for 30 years and has learned that words like suspicious have downstream paperwork consequences. We're looking at the building's IT system. It may be coincidence. It was not coincidence. We both knew it was not coincidence, and we both knew that knowing it and proving it were different countries. The Benin bronze, I said. The piece Ashford returned. Do you have it? We looked at it. It's in evidence storage. Standard Benin brass plaque, about 14 by 10 inches, mid-period, depicts a court scene with 3 figures. Documentation attached shows it came through a dealer in Brussels, through a New York importer, to Hartwell's inventory. What's the gap in the provenance? Ashford said there was a gap. There's a period between 1970 and 1995 where the piece's location is unaccounted for. Before 1970, it was apparently in a private collection in Lagos. After 1995, it surfaces in Brussels. He looked at me steadily. The 1970 to 1995 period covers some fairly significant political instability in Nigeria, I said. Yes, things moved, not always voluntarily. The Hartwell documentation doesn't address where it was during those 25 years. Ashford's people caught it and flagged it. I thanked Kramer for his time and his restraint, and he told me to tell Wolfe to stay in his house and let the department do its job, which is what he always says and which he knows Wolfe will ignore. I had 3 things to take home with me. The basement camera failure was too precise to be accidental. The Benin bronze had a 25-year gap in its history that coincided with a period of significant cultural property removal from Nigeria. And Daniel Voss, the man the police had arrested, could not be placed leaving a building that he had demonstrably entered. On the cab ride back to 35th Street, I added a 4th thing. Ferreira had been in New York 2 weeks before the murder. He had argued with Edmund, and nobody who knew about it had mentioned him to the police. That's a lot of people choosing the same silence. In my experience, coordinated silence doesn't coordinate itself. I gave Wolfe the report at 2 o'clock. He was at his desk, working through a seed catalog with the focused pleasure he brings to any examination of growth and cultivation. He listened, set the catalog aside, and was quiet for 90 seconds, which I counted. The basement camera, he said. Yes. If you wished to enter or exit that building unseen, and you knew that camera's coverage, disabling it would be your first practical step. He put his fingertips together, which means either someone within the building's management or IT infrastructure assisted, or someone had sufficient access and knowledge to disable it independently. Or it's a coincidence, I said, because someone has to maintain the possibility. It is not a coincidence, Wolfe said. The window of failure is too precisely bounded. 6:40 to 11:15 brackets the relevant period with professional tidiness. He reached for his beer. It was past noon, so Fritz had provided it, and took a measured sip. Tell me about Ferreira. Have you located him? I had spent Tuesday evening on that question. Paulo Ferreira had returned to Lisbon after his New York visit, but he maintained what appeared to be a business address in London. He was not on any law enforcement watch list that my contacts could confirm. though he appeared in a 2019 U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service field report as a person of interest in connection with an Ivory Transit investigation that had subsequently been closed without charges. Like Hartwell did. Different end of the supply chain, but same methodology. Documentation that's just adequate and a determined incuriosity about what's upstream of it. And he argued with Hartwell 2 weeks before the murder. Wolfe drummed his fingers once on the desk. The question we haven't answered is what the argument was about. Cho heard the tone, but not the content. Yes, a pause. And the Benin bronze that Ashford returned. The 25-year gap. The gap covers the Biafran War period and its aftermath. A lot of Nigerian cultural property moved during and after that period. Some of it through legitimate purchase, some not. If that piece was improperly removed from Nigeria, looted essentially, it would have significant consequences for anyone in the chain of provenance. He looked at the ceiling. It would also be a powerful piece of leverage. I followed that. If someone knew the true origin of the piece, they could threaten to expose it. Hartwell's whole business would unravel. Not merely his business, his liberty potentially. The importation of illegally acquired cultural property is a federal matter. He lowered his gaze to the desk. Edmund Hartwell refused to refund Ashford's purchase. Why? He had a legal opinion supporting his position, but the legal opinion addressed the documentation's adequacy at the point of sale, not the underlying legitimacy of the piece itself. I thought about that. Unless Edmund knew the documentation was technically sufficient, but substantively false. In which case, drawing more attention to the piece was the last thing he wanted. And returning it to Ashford, with a formal acknowledgement of a provenance dispute, would be worse still. Wolfe nodded slowly. He was trapped between Ashford's demands, which he couldn't safely meet, and Ashford's anger, which was dangerous. Where does Ferreira fit in? That is what I intend to find out. He picked up the seed catalog, then put it down again. Archie, I want you to arrange interviews, in this office. All 4 of them, Cho, Trent, Ashford, and whoever you can reach regarding Ferreira's current whereabouts. Tomorrow, if possible. Day after, at the latest. You want to see them all here? I want to observe them in a room I control, where the conditions favor clarity. He opened the catalog. Also contact Miss Hartwell. I have a question for her about her brother's personal correspondence that should have been my first question, which is whether she found in his papers any reference to a payment made in the 18 months before his death, a payment made not to a supplier or a shipping company, but to a private individual, in a currency or manner inconsistent with his normal business practice. I looked at him. He was already reading about orchid cultivation. That's a very specific question, I said. It addresses a very specific hypothesis, he said. Good afternoon, Archie. I went to the phone and started making calls. Wolfe conducts his office interviews with a theatrical instinct he would vigorously deny. The chairs are placed. The light falls from specific windows. He is already at his desk when the subject enters, which establishes without belabor who is at home and who is a visitor. He has Fritz bring beer or coffee or water at precise intervals, calibrated to the rhythm of the conversation, which either relaxes the subject or unnerves them, depending on their temperament. On Thursday he saw them in the following order: Cho at 10, Trent at 2, Ashford at 4. I was present for all 3. My job during these sessions is threefold: observe, record, and stay quiet unless Wolfe signals otherwise. The signal is a glance to his right, which means he wants me to take over a line of questioning. He uses it sparingly, which means when it comes, the subject doesn't anticipate it. Raymond Cho came in with his wire-rimmed glasses and his quality of practiced stillness, and sat in the red leather chair with the composure of a man who has decided in advance exactly what he will and will not say. Wolfe studied him for a moment, with the eyes half closed, and then opened the conversation at the wrong end of it, which is his preferred method. Mr. Cho, he said, the basement camera at the Hartwell building, did you know it was non-operational on the evening of the 14th? Whatever Cho had prepared himself for, it wasn't that. The stillness cracked slightly. Not dramatically, barely enough to register, but I registered it. "No," he said, "I didn't know that." "You had occasion to be in the building on the evening in question?" "No, I left at 7:30. "Through the lobby?" "Yes. The lobby camera would confirm that." "I assume it would. I haven't asked." Wolfe let the pause extend beyond what's comfortable. "You told Archie that you arranged accommodations for Paulo Ferreira. That you booked a room for him at the Warwick, as Edmund Hartwell's agent." "Yes." "Did you communicate with Ferreira directly, beyond the accommodation arrangements?" A careful, measured pause. "We exchanged emails about the booking. Nothing beyond that." "And the argument you heard through the office door? You said you didn't know the content." "That's correct. But you heard enough to recognize that it was an argument, not a heated business discussion, not an animated negotiation, but an argument." "Yes." "What distinguished it as such?" Cho's hands in his lap adjusted their position slightly. Ferreira raised his voice. Edmund didn't. Edmund rarely raised his voice, but his responses became shorter and faster. The rhythm changed. What was Ferreira's voice doing when it was raised? Demanding? Accusing? Threatening? Another pause. "Threatening," Cho said finally. The quality was, it was threatening. Wolfe nodded once. "Mr. Cho, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to understand that the answer you give me in this room, now, is considerably less consequential than the answer you may be required to give in other rooms, if this investigation proceeds past its current point. Was the shipping documentation you processed for the Hartwell-Ferreira supply chain legitimate?" The pause this time was long enough that I counted it. 11 seconds. "It was compliant with what was provided to me," Cho said. "Whether what was provided to me accurately reflected the actual origin of every piece." He stopped. "Yes." "I had doubts about some of the older pieces, the ones with pre-1990 provenance in West African inventories. The documentation was consistent, but the consistency was almost too smooth. Real provenance has gaps. Real records have holes. Some of the Ferreira material was seamless in a way that made me uneasy." "But you processed it?" "I processed it." "And said nothing?" "And said nothing." He looked at his hands. "I have a daughter starting college next year." Wolfe did not comment on this. He asked 3 more questions about the logistics of the Ferreira shipments, timings, volumes, the specific pieces involved, and then told Cho he might be required to return for a subsequent conversation, and that he should not leave the city. Cho nodded and left with the demeanor of a man who has just discovered that the floor he's been standing on has less structural integrity than he'd assumed. Margot Trent came at 2 o'clock and sat in the red leather chair with a straightness of spine that told me she'd decided on an armor of composure and was committed to it. She looked better than she had at her apartment. Not well, but functional. She'd made choices about her appearance that communicated that she intended to be taken seriously, and she was right to make them. Wolfe was gentler with her than he'd been with Cho, which surprised me until I understood why. He wasn't being kind, he was being tactical. He'd assessed that Trent's armor was held together by an act of will, not by calculation, and that the way to get past it was not pressure, but a kind of careful, patient proximity. "Miss Trent," he said, "you were Edmund Hartwell's secretary for how long?" 7 years. "You knew his habits and his manner thoroughly?" "Yes." "Then I want to ask you about something that would have required knowing both." He leaned back slightly. "On the evening he died, someone was in that office with him. Someone he admitted, not someone who broke in. The locks showed no tampering, the windows were secured. He let his killer in, or his killer was already present. The police said the same thing. Voss had a key," Wolfe said, "but Voss, according to the evidence as I understand it, cannot be placed leaving the building through any recorded exit. That suggests either Voss is still unaccounted for in a way the police haven't resolved, or someone else was in that building who used the basement exit while the camera was down." Trent looked at him. Are you asking me if I let someone in? I'm asking you if anyone came to the office between the time Cho left at 7:30 and the time you found the body at 10:23. A pause. Someone called at approximately 8 o'clock. I kept my face neutral. I'd been wondering when this would surface. Called how? Wolfe said. By telephone? By buzzer from the lobby? By the internal building intercom, from downstairs. I answered the desk intercom. And? They asked for Edmund by name. They didn't identify themselves. I told them to come up. I assumed. She stopped. Edmund had told me he might have a visitor that evening. He hadn't told me who. He told you to expect someone, but didn't identify them. He said, I may have someone coming by after 8. Just let them up. Those were his words. He said it in the afternoon. Wolfe's finger moved on the blotter. And you let this person up? Yes. I pressed the lobby release. Did you see this person? No. I assumed they went directly to Edmund's office. I was working at my desk. The outer office and Edmund's office are separated by a short hall. I heard the door open and close. A pause. I assumed Edmund greeted them. I continued working. You heard nothing from Edmund's office after that? I had music playing, through earphones. I do sometimes when I'm working late and the office is quiet. She looked at her hands. The police know I had the earphones in. They consider it relevant. It is relevant, Wolfe said, without unkindness. You heard nothing. When did you become aware that something was wrong? At 10:23 I went to tell Edmund I was leaving. I knocked. No answer. The door was ajar. She was precise and steady. I went in. Miss Trent. Wolfe's tone hadn't changed, but something in the air of the room had. Edmund told you to expect a visitor, but didn't say who. In 7 years as his secretary, did he do that often? Conceal the identity of a visitor from you? She thought about it honestly. Occasionally, usually when it was something he considered private, personal matters, or business matters he preferred to keep from the general record. Yes, she said, quietly, sometimes that. The evening visitor based on the building intercom, would the voice have been recorded? The intercom has a log. The lobby system keeps audio records for security purposes. Wolfe glanced at me. I made a note. That log would be subpoenaed or otherwise accessed, ideally before the police thought to request it, for reasons beyond the Voss arrest. After Trent left, I said, she held that back. She held it back from the police, Wolfe said. She told us relatively readily. She wants this solved. She simply hadn't been asked the right questions. He was quiet for a moment. A visitor Edmund expected, but didn't name. A visitor who came up through the lobby intercom, rather than by prior announcement. That is a caller who didn't want to be visible in the lobby security system, Archie. They used the intercom to be let directly up, rather than checking in at the front desk. Which would have required knowing there was an intercom system and how it worked. Correct, which means someone familiar with the building. Victor Ashford arrived at 4, with the punctuality of someone who considers lateness a social offense and early arrival an imposition. Which placed him exactly on time and communicated all of this simultaneously. He took in the brownstone office, with the practiced assessment of a collector, paused briefly on the Renoir sketch, with an expression that told me he knew exactly what it was and approximately what it was worth, and sat in the red leather chair as if he'd chosen it himself. Wolfe opened with pleasantries about the state of the private antiquities market, which is not a topic I would have selected, but which was clearly chosen because it was Ashford's native ground, and because how a man walks on native ground tells you things. Ashford was fluent and authoritative, and carried himself with the ease of expertise. After 3 minutes of this, Wolfe turned a corner without announcing it. Mr. Ashford, the Ben in bronze you returned to Hartwell. You engaged legal counsel regarding the provenance dispute. What specifically did your legal team find? They found that the documentation had a material gap between 1970 and 1995. Yes. And your legal team's assessment of what occurred during that gap? Ashford looked at Wolfe with the eyes of a man recalculating. He had come in expecting certain questions, and the terrain was different. They concluded the piece was almost certainly removed from Nigeria during the period of political instability following the Biafran conflict. That its presence in a Lagos private collection before 1970 was documented. That its emergence in Brussels in 1995 had no credible innocent explanation. Looted, in other words. That was their assessment. And you confronted Hartwell with this assessment. I presented it to him, through counsel. And he refused to address it. He refused to accept the documentation findings as a basis for refund. Wolfe folded his hands. Mr. Ashford, you've been a collector for, how long? 30 years. In 30 years of collecting, you have certainly acquired other pieces with imperfect provenance. This is not unusual in the market, as you know better than I do. The question I want to put to you is this. Why did this particular piece, with this particular provenance gap, generate such a vigorous response from you? Other collectors have sat with comparable ambiguities. You went to lawyers. You confronted Hartwell directly. You made— Wolfe paused very precisely, a threatening remark. What made this piece different? Ashford was silent for a long moment. His composure was still intact, but it had the quality of something being held in place by conscious effort. I have a reputation, he said finally. I've built it over 30 years. If it became known that I held a piece with that kind of provenance, looted wartime material from Nigeria, the professional and social consequences would be significant. And you believed Hartwell had known this when he sold it to you? Yes. Did you have evidence of that he knew? Another pause, longer. Ferreira knew, Ashford said. I came to know, through channels I won't specify, that Ferreira had flagged the provenance issue to Hartwell before the piece was sold to me, internally, in their supply chain communication. Hartwell had the information and chose to sell it anyway. You had access to Hartwell and Ferreira's internal communication. Ashford said nothing. Mr. Ashford, Wolfe's voice hadn't changed in temperature. I'm not a law enforcement agency. I have no subpoena power, and I am not recording this conversation for official purposes. I want Edmund Hartwell's killer identified. Whatever you tell me that serves that purpose will be used for that purpose. So, how did you obtain access to their internal communications? A long pause. Then, my son-in-law works in cybersecurity. I asked him, some months ago, to look into certain aspects of Hartwell's business operations. He said it with the tone of a man who has rehearsed the statement and found it adequate. He was able to access email records. I saw correspondence between Hartwell and Ferreira regarding the Benin piece. Hartwell knew. He sold it anyway. And you used this knowledge as the basis for your legal action. Yes. Without revealing to your lawyers how you'd obtained it. Correct. Wolfe looked at him steadily. Mr. Ashford, Paulo Ferreira visited Hartwell 2 weeks before his death, and they argued. I believe the argument concerned the Benin bronze. What do you know about that meeting? Ashford shifted in his chair. Barely, but enough. I know Ferreira was here. I didn't know about the argument. Did you communicate with Ferreira at any point regarding the provenance dispute? A pause of the kind that's slightly too considered to be innocent. Briefly. Recently? A month before Edmund died. About the Benin bronze. About the general situation with Hartwell's business practices. At whose initiative? Ashford looked at Wolfe for a moment with the expression of someone deciding how much rope they can trust their interlocutor with. Then, Ferreira called me. It was the answer Wolfe had been navigating toward for 20 minutes, and Wolfe received it without expression. He thanked Ashford for his time, told him to remain available for further questions, and let Fritz show him out. When the front door closed, I looked at Wolfe. Ferreira called Ashford, I said. Yes. Wolfe reached for his beer. Ferreira called Ashford, which means Ferreira was doing more during his New York visit than arguing with Hartwell. He was positioning, building something. A pause. Archie, the lobby intercom audio log. Get it today, if possible. And what are you doing while I'm doing that? I, said Wolfe, am going to read everything available on the trade routes used for West African ivory in the past 15 years. Fritz has prepared a navarin of lamb for dinner, and I intend to earn it. He reached for his book. I reached for my coat. I have a complicated relationship with the kind of day that requires me to be in 6 places, none of them comfortable, with a persistent feeling that the answers are sitting just beyond what I currently know, like a word on the tip of your tongue that keeps declining to arrive. Thursday was that kind of day, extended into Friday morning. The lobby intercom system turned out to be managed by a building security company that had a recording protocol and a legal department that needed convincing. I spent 2 hours on that, before calling a contact at the DA's office, which produced the relevant pressure in the relevant quarter, and resulted in my obtaining a copy of the audio log by 4 o'clock Thursday. The recording from the 8 o'clock call was 22 seconds long. A voice, male, low with a slight accent, that I initially placed as vaguely European, before listening more carefully, and settling on Portuguese, asked for Edmund Hartwell by name. Trent's voice answered, confirmed he was in, and the line went to the door release. 22 seconds and an accent were not a conviction, but they were a direction. I sent a copy to Wolfe, who listened to it twice and said, play it again, and then said nothing for 30 seconds, and then said, yes, which is Wolfe for confirmed hypothesis, though getting him to specify which hypothesis takes more effort than I had available that evening. The second thing I needed was Ferreira's location. I'd established he had a London business address, but the London number rang to a voicemail that didn't give a name. I spent an hour working through contacts, until I found a freelance investigator in London who owed me a professional courtesy, and by Friday morning I had a confirmation that Ferreira had not returned to London after his New York visit, as I'd initially been told. He was, according to my London contacts information, currently in New York, had not left, had been staying at a hotel in Midtown that was not the Warwick, a smaller place on 44th Street, checked in under a variant of his name that was close enough to be careless, but different enough to be deliberate. He was still here. He'd been here the whole time, while the police arrested Voss and closed their working theory. I called Wolfe and gave him this. Is he aware he's been found? Wolfe asked. I can't know that. My London contact was discreet. Go to the hotel. Observe whether he remains. Do not approach him. And if he's packing, then approach him and explain that I wish to speak with him, and that speaking with me privately is considerably preferable to the alternative, which will become obvious to him. That is as close to a threat as Wolfe allows himself in initial outreach. I went to the hotel. He was in the lobby bar with a glass of something amber, reading a newspaper with the slightly theatrical relaxation of someone who is using the newspaper as a screen. He was a man of 55 or so, broad through the shoulders, with gray at his temples, and eyes that assessed me before I'd crossed half the lobby. He knew I wasn't a guest. People who make their living in the gray zones of international commerce develop a fine-tuned awareness of people who are looking for them specifically, as opposed to people who are simply present. I sat down across from him without invitation. He didn't object. Mr. Ferreira, I said, my name is Archie Goodwin. I work for Nero Wolfe, who is investigating the murder of Edmund Hartwell. Mr. Wolfe would like to speak with you. I'm here to convey that invitation, and to note that it's considerably more comfortable than whatever conversation you'll eventually have with the federal agencies, who are going to find it extremely interesting that you're still in New York. He looked at me for a long moment over his newspaper, which he hadn't lowered. You are not the police. Correct. Then I have no obligation to speak with your employer. None whatsoever, I agreed pleasantly. You also have no obligation to stay in this city, and yet here you are. I let that sit. Whatever reason is keeping you in New York, Mr. Ferreira, it's not going away by waiting. It's complicated by waiting. Mr. Wolfe is very good at clarifying complicated situations. and he has a strong interest in the actual perpetrator of this crime, rather than in the collateral damage to anyone's business operations. He looked at his drink, then at me. Your employer has this reputation. He has several reputations. That one's accurate. A pause. Tomorrow, he said. I will come tomorrow, in the afternoon. 3 o'clock, I said. West 35th Street. I gave him the address. He wrote it in the margin of his newspaper, with a pen he produced from his jacket pocket, capped the pen, and returned to reading. I left him there. Back at the brownstone, I found Wolfe had not been idle. He had, over the course of the day, conducted what he calls his desk research, which in practice means he's read everything available on a subject, and cross-referenced it against what he already knows and what the case has produced. And he laid out for me, over dinner, the shape of what he'd assembled. The West African ivory trade, he explained, had two broad phases in the relevant modern period. Before the 1989 international ban, there was a legal market with significant gray areas. After 1989, the trade went underground, but never stopped. The documentation systems that emerged in the post-ban period were sophisticated forgeries, not crude fakes, but carefully constructed paperwork trails that created the appearance of legal provenance for pieces that had moved through the ban's window in ways that couldn't survive scrutiny. Ferreira occupied a specific niche in this ecosystem. He was not a poacher or a trafficker in the raw physical sense. He was a documentation architect. A man who created the paper trails that allowed pieces to move from origin to market. He was exceptionally good at it, which was why he'd operated for 15 years without prosecution. The gap in the Benin bronze's provenance, 1970 to 1995, was almost certainly covered by a Ferreira-style documentation package that had become, at some point, unreliable. Perhaps because a competing record surfaced. Perhaps because the original sources had been documented elsewhere in a way that contradicted Ferreira's version. Ashford said Ferreira knew about the provenance problem, I said. He flagged it to Hartwell before the sale. Yes. Wolfe poured from the wine bottle that Fritz had opened with the beef. But consider the sequence. Ferreira flags the problem internally. Hartwell sells the piece to Ashford anyway. Ashford's people discover the gap and threaten legal action. Hartwell refuses to act. And then Ferreira comes to New York and argues with Hartwell. Because Hartwell selling a compromised piece created exposure for Ferreira. The documentation that covered the 1970 to 95 gap was Ferreira's work. If that documentation is scrutinized in a legal proceeding, Ashford's lawsuit, or a federal investigation, Ferreira's methodology becomes visible. Wolfe set down his wine glass. Hartwell selling that piece was, from Ferreira's perspective, a catastrophic security breach. Hartwell was supposed to hold it, not sell it. I followed the logic. So Ferreira came to demand what? At minimum, that Hartwell manage the situation, withdraw from the legal dispute with Ashford quietly, return the piece, and contain the damage. Wolfe paused. At maximum, he left it there. At maximum, he came to handle the problem himself, I said. It is one of the possibilities we must examine. He turned his wineglass by its stem. There is another thread we haven't fully pulled. Cecilia Hartwell. I asked her about irregular payments in her brother's records. I forgot about that. What did she find? She found nothing in his business records, but she found something in his personal bank statements, which she has access to as executor of his estate. In the 14 months before his death, Edmund Hartwell made 6 payments of $5,000 each to an entity she doesn't recognize. The payments went to a numbered account. I set down my fork. $30,000. $30,000 in 6 installments to an unidentified recipient. Wolfe looked at his plate. The payments began 2 months after the Benin bronze was sold to Ashford. They stopped 2 months before Hartwell's death. The shape of something was assembling itself at the edge of my thinking. Payments that started after the sale and stopped 2 months before the murder. Yes, that sounds like blackmail that ended, I said. Or a protective arrangement that was terminated. Wolfe put down his own fork. Either Edmund was being extorted by someone with knowledge of the bronze's true provenance, or he was paying someone for protection or silence, and that arrangement was cancelled. He was quiet for a moment. If the arrangement was cancelled, if the payments stopped, we need to know why they stopped, and who received them. Can we trace the numbered account? Through official channels, not easily. Through other channels, he looked at me. Do you still have a relationship with that banking contact in the Cayman subsidiary? It's been 2 years, but probably. Use it. I used it. It took until Friday evening and required a favor I'd been holding for a serious occasion, but I had the answer by 8 o'clock. The numbered account received the payments and forwarded them within 24 hours to a personal account in Lisbon. I walked into the office, where Wolfe was reading about Belgian orchid cultivation and eating a slice of Fritz's plum cake, and I said, "Ferreira. The payments went to Ferreira." Wolfe set down his book. Did they? Hartwell was paying Ferreira for 14 months, 30,000 total, then stopped 2 months before the murder. Wolfe was quiet for long enough that I ate half of my own slice of plum cake. Then the argument, he said finally, was not Ferreira demanding Hartwell manage the Ashford situation. The argument was about the payments. He turned his wine glass. Edmund stopped paying. Ferreira came to collect, or to threaten, or to do what he ultimately did, I said. We are not certain of that yet, Wolfe said. Tomorrow, with Ferreira in this office, we will test it. He looked at the ceiling. Archie, call Kramer. Don't tell him about Ferreira. Tell him about the basement camera. Tell him I believe it was deliberately disabled, and I can demonstrate the technical specifics of how it was done, if he sends someone competent to look at it. That will occupy the department for the next 24 hours, and position them correctly for what follows. What follows being? The gathering, he said. I want all of them here, Saturday afternoon. Ferreira at 3, the others at 4. Arrange it. You're going to solve it in the room. He looked at me with the expression he reserves for statements of the obvious. That, he said, is what I do. Saturday morning, Wolfe spent 2 hours with his orchids and emerged looking satisfied in a way that had nothing to do with the case, which is one of his useful qualities. He can genuinely set things aside. Over breakfast he asked Fritz about a stock of white truffle he'd been expecting, and learned it had arrived and was being treated with appropriate reverence. He read 3 chapters of a book about medieval Flemish trade routes. He drank his coffee. I, meanwhile, confirmed the afternoon's arrangements, briefed myself on everything we had, and made one final call, to a name I'd been sitting on since Wednesday, one that had surfaced in the Fish and Wildlife Service field report about Ferreira. A former USFWS investigator, retired to Connecticut, who had worked the 2019 inquiry that had been closed without charges. Her name was Helen Marsh. She was 71, retired, and when I explained who I worked for and what I needed, she was quiet for a moment, and then said, I've been waiting for someone to call about Ferreira for 6 years. What she told me added the last piece. The 2019 investigation had closed, not because Ferreira was clean, but because the key witness, a shipping company employee in Lagos who had personal knowledge of the documentation practices, had recanted his statement, abruptly, shortly after the payments to Ferreira's Lisbon account from an unidentified New York source had begun. Shortly, in other words, after Edmund Hartwell started paying. Hartwell hadn't been paying Ferreira to protect himself. He'd been paying Ferreira to keep the 2019 investigation closed. The payments were for the witness's silence, routed through Ferreira. When the payments stopped, the witness became available again. The witness, I said. Is he still available? His name is Adewale Obi, she said, and he contacted the USFWS again 6 weeks ago, voluntarily. He said he wanted to correct his earlier statement. 6 weeks ago. 2 weeks after Ferreira had been in New York arguing with Edmund Hartwell about the stopped payments. The USFWS investigation has been reopened? I asked. Quietly, she said. Still in the early stages. They don't have enough yet for a case, but they will. I thanked her and sat for a while looking out the brownstone office window at West 35th Street, where a Saturday in October was going about its business in the way streets do, with magnificent indifference to the machinery of human consequence that operates behind the facades. The architecture of it was clear now, or clear enough. Edmund Hartwell had been paying Ferreira to keep a federal investigation closed. When he stopped paying, for reasons we didn't yet know, though I had a hypothesis involving the Ashford lawsuit and the risk that additional attention would compound his exposure, Ferreira had come to New York to restore the arrangement by force. They had argued, the witness had re-emerged, and someone, in the time between 8 and 10 on the evening of the 14th, had gone up to the 14th floor of a building on 57th Street, through a lobby intercom system rather than the front desk, and killed Edmund Hartwell with a piece of his own collection. The question that remained, the question Wolfe would answer this afternoon, was who had gone up, because the audio on the intercom was 22 seconds of a low voice with an accent. And while that accent was consistent with Ferreira, accents are not fingerprints. And because, at the moment Wolfe had laid out his analysis for me the previous evening, I had noticed something that was sitting at the edge of everything, a detail that didn't quite fit the shape we'd assembled. Victor Ashford had said Ferreira called him. Not that Ashford had sought Ferreira out. Ferreira had called Ashford to discuss the Hartwell situation. Why would Ferreira, whose exposure depended on containing the situation, call the one person whose lawsuit was most likely to blow it open? What did Ferreira want from Ashford? I went to find Wolfe. He was at his desk, having come down from the plant rooms, and was rereading his notes from the Thursday interviews, with an expression of concentrated precision. "The Ashford-Ferreira phone call," I said. He looked up. "Yes." "Why did Ferreira initiate contact with Ashford?" "Ashford is the problem from Ferreira's perspective. Ashford's lawsuit is what's going to expose the bronze's provenance. Why call him?" Wolfe set down his notes. "What do you conclude?" "I conclude that Ferreira wasn't trying to stop the lawsuit. He was trying to use it." I sat down. "If Ashford wins his lawsuit, if Edmund is formally found to have sold a piece under fraudulent provenance, Edmund is exposed and destroyed, professionally. That's actually what Ferreira wants. A destroyed Edmund can't do anything further to threaten Ferreira. The payments are irrelevant. Edmund's testimony about the documentation practices is discredited." Wolfe's finger moved on the blotter. "Continue. Ferreira called Ashford to encourage the lawsuit, or to provide information that would strengthen it, to make sure Edmund went down through official channels, which would paradoxically protect Ferreira, because a targeted prosecution of Edmund would focus on Edmund's decisions as a dealer, not on the broader documentation network behind the supply chain. Edmund would burn," Wolfe said, "and Ferreira would be the ash he burned in." "Yes, which means Ferreira didn't need to kill Edmund. The lawsuit was going to do it. Professionally, financially, probably legally." I stopped. So if Ferreira's goal was to be achieved through the lawsuit, why would he risk killing Edmund at all? Wolfe was very quiet. "He wouldn't," he said, "unless he didn't." We sat with that for a moment. "Then who used the intercom with a Portuguese accent?" I said. Wolfe looked at me. "Archie, think about the payments. $30,000 to Ferreira's account for 14 months. Who knew those payments were being made? Hartwell and Ferreira. Anyone else?" I thought about the banking records, about who had access to Edmund Hartwell's financial records, about a person who had been in Edmund's professional life for 7 years, and who knew his habits and his methods and the building's intercom system and the location of the ivory figurine on the desk. I heard myself say it before I'd fully decided to. Margot Trent. Wolfe's expression didn't change, but his eyes did. "Tell me your reasoning." She kept his books, or had access to them. She was his secretary. She handled correspondence and invoices. She would have seen the outgoing payments. She knew about Ferreira. Not necessarily the details, but the name, the connection. She knew the building. She knew the figurine. I stopped. She knew Edmund was expecting a visitor that evening, but didn't know who. That's what she told us. Or, Wolfe said quietly, she was the visitor, and told us she'd admitted a visitor in order to create a person the investigation would seek. The room felt different. But her motive. 7 years, Wolfe said. 7 years of proximity to a man who used the relationship for his convenience, while conducting business dealings that, if exposed, would destroy him and potentially implicate her, and who was, at the moment of his death, in the process of being dismantled from 3 directions simultaneously. He paused. What does a person in that position feel, Archie, when they realize the man they've protected and accommodated for 7 years is about to collapse, taking with him everything they've built, and has known for months that it was coming, and said nothing to her? I thought about Margot Trent's spine, very straight in the red leather chair, the composure that was held in place by will, not calculation. She found out about the payments, I said. I believe she did. I believe she found out about the payments to Ferreira, understood what they meant, understood that Edmund had been buying protection for himself while leaving her exposed in the business. And, he stopped. This is what we will establish this afternoon. He picked up his book, then set it down. One thing more, he said. The accent on the intercom. 22 seconds. A low voice, slightly European, that you and I both heard as consistent with Portuguese. Yes. Is it possible that someone who knew Ferreira, who had spoken with him, heard his voice, could produce a passable approximation of his accent in 22 seconds of lobby intercom audio? I thought about the quality of the recording. The intercom's audio was functional, rather than high fidelity. In 22 seconds over a lobby intercom, with degraded audio, I said, yes, it's possible. Wolfe picked up his book and this time opened it. Bring them all at 4, Archie. Ferreira at 3 as arranged. I went to make the calls. Ferreira arrived at 3 with the punctuality of a professional, and the posture of a man who has calculated his options, and decided that voluntary cooperation, carefully bounded, is preferable to its alternatives. He was, in person, more impressive than his hotel lobby profile had suggested. There was a quality of controlled intelligence about him that explained how he built a successful operation in an industry that requires both technical sophistication and the ability to read people quickly. He sat in the red leather chair and looked at Wolfe with the frank assessment of someone accustomed to sizing up counterparties. Wolfe met the assessment and did not blink. Mr. Ferreira, he said, I'm not going to pretend this is a comfortable conversation for you. A man you did business with has been murdered. Your name is nowhere in the official investigation, despite your presence in New York for the relevant period, and a federal inquiry into the supply chain you helped construct has recently been reopened. Against that background, you came here voluntarily. I take that as a sign of intelligence, rather than naivety. Ferreira nodded once. You said what I tell you here will be used to find the killer, not for other purposes. I said, Wolfe corrected carefully, that I would use what you tell me to identify the killer. I cannot promise what investigations may be opened as a result, independently, by others. What I can promise is that my interest is narrow and my purpose is singular. A pause. Then Ferreira said, What do you want to know? The evening of the 14th. Where were you between 8 and 10? In my hotel room, on the phone with my office in Lisbon. My office can confirm. I believe they can and will, Wolfe said. Tell me about the argument with Hartwell. Ferreira was quiet for a moment. Then he told it, and told it with a clarity that suggested he'd decided to tell the truth because the truth was the safest available option. The payments had been his arrangement. He'd managed the Lagos witness, kept him quiet, taken his percentage. When the payments stopped, the witness started talking. Ferreira came to New York to re-establish the arrangement, or to at least understand why Edmund had stopped. Edmund's explanation was that the Ashford lawsuit had made additional financial exposure untenable, that he was already too visible, that continuing the payments would create a paper trail that could be used against him in discovery. He said he would not pay, Ferreira said. I told him what would follow. He understood. He was frightened, but he had decided. He looked at his hands. I called Ashford, as you perhaps know. I gave him information about the documentation practices, not because I wanted the lawsuit to succeed. A lawsuit means scrutiny, but because I wanted Edmund to understand that the situation would proceed without him if he chose not to cooperate. You were negotiating, Wolfe said. I was demonstrating leverage. There is a difference. A narrow one. You called Ashford from New York? Yes. 2 days after my meeting with Edmund. During this call, did you identify yourself to Ashford? Ferreira almost smiled. I did not give my name. But Ashford, in due course, determined who had called. I assume so. He is not stupid. No, Wolfe agreed. He is not. A pause. Mr. Ferreira, Miss Trent, Hartwell's secretary, did you know her? A slight shift. I met her once, when I came to the office. Had you had any contact with her beyond that? No. She knew of you, however, by name at minimum. Possibly, Edmund may have mentioned my name in her presence. Did Edmund keep his financial records in a way that his secretary would access? Ferreira considered this. He kept his personal banking separately. His business accounts, yes, she would have had access through the business accounts. But the payments to me went through personal banking. He asked 3 more questions. Technical questions about the documentation methodology, the Lagos supply route, the specific pieces involved, and then thanked Ferreira and told him to remain available and to give a full statement to the USFWS investigator, who would contact him within 48 hours. Ferreira left. I raised an eyebrow at Wolfe. You're serving him to the USFWS. I promised to use what he told me to find the killer, Wolfe said. I made no promises about his documentation practices. He looked at the clock. The others arrive in 45 minutes. Bring Kramer. I called Kramer. He came, as he always does when Wolfe summons him, in a tone that implies he won't like the alternative, grumbling in the particular register of a man who has made peace with the fact that his grumbling has never once deflected the outcome. In the 45 minutes before the 4 o'clock gathering, Wolfe laid out for Kramer and for me the complete framework of what he intended to present. Kramer listened, interrupting twice with the specific objections of a man who needs to be certain the machinery will hold before he puts his name on it. Wolfe answered both objections. Kramer sat back, pulled at his lip, and said, "If you're right." "I am right," Wolfe said, without visible effort. "You need the account trace confirmed before this holds in court." "The account trace is confirmed. Archie has it. Additionally, the building's intercom recording will require analysis by a voice expert, which you will arrange." Kramer looked at me. I nodded. "And the basement camera. Your IT people, if they have done their job in the 48 hours since I notified you, will have found the remote access signature on the camera's management system. The camera was disabled remotely using credentials associated with the building management company. A subpoena to the management company's IT records will identify whose credentials were used, or rather, whose credentials were accessed without their knowledge, because the actual act was performed from outside, by someone who had obtained those credentials through other means." Kramer pulled at his lip again. "Through what means?" Wolfe looked at me. "Ashford's son-in-law," I said. "The cybersecurity person, who accessed Hartwell's email at Ashford's request. If he was good enough to do that, he was good enough to obtain building management credentials." Kramer stared at me, then at Wolfe. "Ashford arranged the camera," Wolfe said. "He did not commit the murder. He provided the conditions for it, whether or not he understood precisely what those conditions would enable." A pause. "That is a question for your lawyers." Kramer looked like a man doing uncomfortable mathematics. "So Ashford and—" "Not and," Wolfe said. "Adjacently. Their interests aligned. They may not have spoken directly. They may not have needed to. The doorbell rang at 3:58. I went to get it. They came in with the varied energies of people who don't know they're walking into the last chapter of something. Cecilia Hartwell, controlled and watchful. Raymond Cho, composed in that particular way that was becoming familiar. Margot Trent, straight-spined, with her armor fully deployed. Victor Ashford, conducting himself with the measured confidence of a man who has arranged things to his satisfaction, and has not yet been informed of the revision. I put Trent in the red leather chair, which is where Wolfe focuses his attention, and arranged the others in the yellow chairs and the 2 additional chairs I'd brought in from the front room. Kramer stood near the door with the stillness of official presence. Wolfe looked at them for a moment. Then he began. "I will not extend this with preliminaries," he said. "You have all been patient, and I won't tax that patience further. I am going to tell you what happened, who is responsible, and why. At the conclusion, Inspector Kramer will take appropriate action." He paused. In the room, nobody moved. Edmund Hartwell was killed on the evening of October 14th by Margot Trent, his secretary of 7 years, using a carved ivory figurine that he kept on his desk, and that she had handled on many occasions, and would not have considered unusual to touch. Trent did not move. Her face did not change. She had very good control, and she used it. But the room changed around her. I saw Cecilia Hartwell's hands grip the arms of her chair, saw Cho look sideways, saw Ashford recalculate visibly. The mechanism was as follows, Wolfe continued. Miss Trent had, in the course of managing Edmund Hartwell's correspondence and professional affairs over 7 years, become aware that he conducted business through a network of suppliers whose documentation practices were, to use a neutral word, creative. She knew of Paulo Ferreira by name, though perhaps not by detail. She was aware that certain pieces in the Hartwell inventory carried provenance risks. This knowledge was the background condition. The immediate cause was something more personal. He looked at Trent. She looked back. At some point in the 14 months before Edmund's death, Miss Trent discovered the payments he was making to Ferreira's account. These payments, 6 transactions of $5,000 each, went from Edmund's personal banking to a numbered account that forwarded to Lisbon. I believe she discovered these payments not through his personal banking records, to which she didn't have direct access, but through a different route. He paused. Archie. My cue. Edmund Hartwell used a personal bookkeeping application that synced across his devices, I said. One of those devices was a tablet he kept in the office that Trent had access to in the course of her work. The payments would have appeared there. Wolfe continued. She saw the payments. She investigated, as an intelligent woman with access to the relevant networks and a 7-year understanding of Edmund's business would investigate. She determined, with reasonable accuracy, that Edmund was paying to suppress a federal investigation, not merely protecting his business, protecting himself. She was the person who processed documentation, communicated with suppliers, maintained records. If the business came down, she came down with it. She had not been party to the decisions that created the exposure. She had simply done her job, and Edmund had not seen fit to tell her what was being done to protect the operation, much less to include her in the protection. Trent's spine was a straight line. Her hands were in her lap. When did the payments stop? Wolfe asked, not her, but rhetorically. 2 months before Edmund's death. Why did they stop? Edmund had concluded that continuing them created more risk than it resolved. The Ashford lawsuit had made him visible. He was withdrawing. He made this decision unilaterally, as he made all decisions, without reference to anyone else's interests. A pause, including Margot Trent's. When Ferreira came to New York to confront Edmund about the stopped payments, Miss Trent did not know he was coming. But she knew shortly after that he had come, because the argument that Cho heard through the door was also audible at a different register in the outer office. She heard it. She didn't hear all of it, but she heard enough to understand that Ferreira was not contained. Trent looked at her hands. It was the first movement she'd made. That was the precipitating event, Wolfe said. Not anger alone, not betrayal alone, but the sudden clarity that the situation was no longer stable, and that Edmund, who had controlled it, had lost control of it, and had done so through the decision to stop paying without any alternative management of the risk. She was going to be exposed, and he had done it to her. Wolfe reached for his beer. He drank it. He set it down. She planned it carefully. She knew the building's camera system because she'd been in that building for 7 years. She didn't disable the basement camera herself. She lacked the technical means. But she is a perceptive woman, and she had observed, over 7 years, a great deal about the people in Edmund's orbit. She knew that Victor Ashford was engaged in a legal dispute that was intensifying. She knew because Edmund's professional correspondence had passed through her, that Ashford had obtained access to internal documentation through an outside party. She'd seen the reference in one of Edmund's private communications about what Ashford must have gotten from outside. She made an inference about the son-in-law. She contacted Ashford. Ashford's head turned sharply. She contacted me? You received a call, Wolfe said. Not from Ferreira, from Miss Trent, describing herself in general terms, offering information about the supply chain that would strengthen your lawsuit, and noting, in the course of this conversation, that the basement camera of the building had a management system that was remotely accessible, and that disabling it would be a matter of straightforward competence for someone with the right technical skills. He looked at Ashford. You provided those skills, not for murder. You didn't know about murder. You provided them because a disabled camera removed a potential obstacle to whatever the caller was planning, and you did not ask what it was. Ashford opened his mouth. Kramer from the door said, I'd advise you to wait, Mr. Ashford. Ashford waited. On the evening of the 14th, Wolfe said, Miss Trent came to the office as she always did. She had the use of a key. She worked late as she sometimes did. When Cho left, she was alone. At some point in the evening, she entered Edmund's office. Not through the main door, which would have been visible from her desk had anyone been watching, but through a brief absence from her own position that she'd constructed to explain. She'd put on earphones. She'd made herself a witness to her own isolation, as it were. The intercom, I said, because Wolfe sometimes passes these moments to me. Yes, she rang the intercom herself, from the desk in the outer office, which also has intercom access. She created the record of a visitor. A voice, low, briefly accented, 22 seconds, that was designed to suggest Ferreira to anyone who heard it later. Ferreira is a plausible suspect. He has motive. He has history with the victim. He has an untraceable profile. If the investigation had proceeded competently, Ferreira would have been the obvious candidate. Instead, Daniel Voss was arrested, which was not part of her design, but which she found tolerable because Voss was equally difficult to convict. Trent raised her head. When she spoke, her voice was as controlled as everything else about her. You haven't described any evidence, she said. You've described a theory. I have described the architecture, Wolfe said. The evidence, the banking records tracing payments to Ferreira, confirm the suppression scheme and establish your knowledge of it. The intercom recording will be analyzed by a voice expert who will compare it against recordings of your voice, which exist in quantity, since you appear on a podcast about professional administration that has 47 episodes. The call you made to Ashford was placed from a prepaid phone, but the cell tower records will place it geographically. The credentials used to disable the basement camera were accessed through the building management system, and the access logs will show a connection from outside the building network, traceable through the chain of technical assistance you arranged. He looked at her. And the figurine. You were careful about surfaces, but you were in that office daily for 7 years. There will be traces of you that no amount of care fully removes. The room was silent. Margot Trent looked at her hands for a long time. Then she looked at Cecilia Hartwell. He was going to let it burn, she said. He had a lawyer. He had options. He could have cooperated with the federal investigation and gotten a deal. He could have managed it. He chose to stop the payments and wait and see what happened. Without telling me, without doing anything to manage my exposure, without considering for one moment that I was in the building he was burning down. She stopped. 7 years. Cecilia Hartwell said nothing. There was grief in her face, but it was complex grief, the kind that contains multiple recognitions, not all of them simple. Kramer moved from the door. After, when the necessary people had been removed, and the remaining ones had left, Ashford in a particular silence that suggested his lawyer was about to have a very busy weekend, Cho with the look of a man recalculating every assumption. I sat in the office with Wolfe, while Fritz brought beer and a plate of cheese that Wolfe contemplated with appropriate ceremony. Cecilia Hartwell had been the last to go. She'd stood in the doorway and looked at Wolfe for a moment, and said, "Thank you, and I'm sorry." "For what?" Wolfe asked. "That the truth was what it was." "Truth is under no obligation to be comfortable," he said. "You wanted to know it. Most people who say they do, don't. You did." She nodded and left. Now I cut a piece of cheese that Fritz had selected from somewhere in the Loire, and thought about ivory figurines and the things people keep on their desks that end up being more significant than they intend. "Ashford," I said, "he didn't know." "He suspected," Wolfe said. "He provided the means without asking the purpose. Courts will determine what that makes him. It is not my department. And Ferreira will have several interesting conversations with federal investigators. He chose to talk to me. He may find that talking to them is equally useful to his situation, or he may not." Wolfe lifted his beer. "That, too, is not my department." "Your department being the identification of truth in conditions of deliberate obscurity." He drank, which has now been accomplished. I ate my cheese. Outside, West 35th Street was doing what it always does on Saturday evenings, going about its business with the cheerful obliviousness of a city that contains at any given moment an extraordinary number of people working through the consequences of decisions they made when they thought they were safe. "She almost got away with it," I said. "She would have gotten away with it if the police had pursued Ferreira adequately instead of settling for Voss." Wolfe looked at the ceiling. Voss was convenient. The fingerprints on the figurine were damning, and the motive was established, and the alibi was imperfect through no fault of his own. It is an old story. "She used the figurine specifically," I said. "It didn't seem like a weapon of convenience." "It was not." Wolfe looked at me. Edmund Hartwell had told her, at some point in their 7 years, where he'd gotten it. The Lagos trip, 2015. The sourcing trip that had, in retrospect, been the beginning of the arrangement with Ferreira. She used the piece that was the origin of everything to end everything. That is either irony or symbolism, depending on whether it was conscious. Was it? "Ask her in 20 years, he said. "I have a book to finish, and Fritz has something with venison planned for tomorrow, and I've been anticipating since Thursday." "Good night, Archie." I said good night and went upstairs, and for a while I sat at my own window, looking out at a city that is very good at keeping its secrets, until someone decides they need to be kept no longer. The ivory figurine had killed Edmund Hartwell, and Margot Trent had killed him with it. And Ashford had helped without knowing, and Cho had known without saying, and Ferreira had built the whole architecture, and would spend considerable time explaining it to people with federal authority. And somewhere in Lisbon, a witness named Adewale Obi had decided the moment had come to tell the truth, had decided that whatever had bought his silence was no longer being paid, and that silence has a price like everything else, and when the price stops being paid, the silence stops too. The ivory trade has a long history of producing violence. Wolfe had said that at the beginning. He was right, as usual. He usually is.